A big hand for Mr. Jerry Hestand.
Good morning, Jefferson. It's good to be here again. I'm wearing my 2001 t-shirt today in commemoration of the event. How about that? Can you see the t-shirt? Yeah. All right. Well, that's our first t-shirt Craig made back in 2001, and I'm wearing that today. So I've been doing this a while. I've been doing it about 16 years. Haven't done it that long. A lot of people said, why don't you write a book? You've got so many stories. So I did, and it came out last March. I'm in the back room if you'd like to visit with me or ask me about my book. All the stories I've talked about today are in my book, so if you're curious, please drop by. This is what I'm talking about today. You know, the famous movie, The Legend of Boggy Creek, said he always follows the creek. Well, there's got to be more than one monster in the woods, so they always follow the creek. I've been working in the four-state area, which is Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, a little bit of Louisiana, and that's what I'll be covering today. But they do follow the creeks, and I found that pattern over the years. I grew up in a little town in north central Texas in the 60s. In the little town I lived in, nobody knew anything about Bigfoot. Nobody had ever heard of it. However, the mothers of the town would tell the children about the booger that lived in the creek. They would tell us, you come back to the house when I call you, or a booger is going to get you. And that's what my mama said. And the children of the town figured out it was a big, tall, hairy, man-made monster that would get us if we didn't come to the house when our mom called us. So at an early age, I knew there could be something mysterious at the creek behind my house. My cousin Janie babysat me when I was little, and she read Nancy Drew mystery books to me, all of them. And I loved them, and I became a miniature detective at the age of 6. And it's amazing the number of Bigfoot researchers that I know. They have Sherlock Holmes DVDs and book collections, and we're all just a bunch of little detectives trying to solve a big problem. So I was interested in animals. I was interested in mysteries. I watched all the horror movies of the day on Saturday afternoon. Scared the bejeebus out of me, but I watched them anyway. And I love the movies because there was always a hero, usually a scientist, trying to find the answer to a monster that lived on the outskirts of town. Everybody laughed at him. Sounds familiar, right? Everybody laughed at him and said, there's no such thing. But eventually he proved the monster's existence and won the hand of the beautiful leading lady. And I said, hey, that's for me. I could do that. Mo Howard, just poke him in the eyes. Didn't bother him, or a pie in the face. But I knew that these things that I saw on Saturday afternoon matinee weren't real. They were men in costumes. But could there be a real booger living in the creek? When I was a freshman in high school, I saw the movie The Legend of Boggy Creek. All my friends saw it. My dad saw it, and he said, hey, it's only a 3-hour drive to Falk, Arkansas. We could go look. And my little buddies and I vowed that when we were driving age, we would go to Falk, Arkansas and look for the Falk monster. Well, they forgot about it, but I didn't. I couldn't forget about it. My dad said, I saw a cool documentary the other night. There was this big old hairy monster walking through a creek in California. Looked like some kind of ape man, and it looked real. And later on, I did see the Patterson-Gimlin film, and today it looks just as real to me now as it did back then. And little did I know, one day I would get to meet one of the players in the film, Bob Gimlin, and he signed this mouse pad for me. And having talked to Bob many times about the film, I think it's the real deal. I mean, it is the real deal, I think. But once again, where was the animal? It was in a creek. This is one of my favorite posters, t-shirts. I like the Bigfoot on this. This looks very similar to the things that my friends say they see. We believe they're apes, no shape or form human, but this is one of my favorite t-shirts. So back in 2000, I got my first computer, real excited, brought it home. First thing I looked for, or one of the first things I looked for, was Bigfoot. And I lucked out and found Texas Bigfoot Research Center that had just been created. I joined and became a member, and I was assigned all of the counties along the Red River, north and south. And I began to investigate. One of my first investigations, I was talking to a witness late one night. He claimed to have seen a Bigfoot walk off of his mother's porch late one night while he and her were watching TV. His brother claimed that he saw the same creature while he was fishing in a nearby creek. The witness said he and his children would walk down this old road, and from the bottom of this old muddy road, they would hear strange vocalizations late in the afternoon. Well, I went to my friend's house one cold winter night. It was raining and misting, and I stayed till 2:30. I had a 2-hour drive home, and I said, hey, I'm going to stop down there at that road you're talking about where you hear the vocalization, see if I can see or hear anything. He said, go ahead, but it's muddy. So I had a tiny little car, an Echo, a Toyota Echo, if y'all remember those. And I drove down to this road. It was too muddy. It was like 6 inches deep in mud tracks. So I stopped at the edge of the road and turned out my lights and rolled down the window. And remember, I'd only been doing Bigfoot research for about 3 months. So I was pretty shook up. And I thought, man, I don't know if I want to hear anything or not. But all of a sudden, as soon as I killed the engine, I heard muddy footsteps coming towards the car. And they got closer, and they got closer, and they got closer. And I said, wait a minute, maybe that's water dripping off the hot engine, but the engine wasn't hot at all. I looked around and I scanned, and there was a big field that had steep terraces going down to this old creek. If memory serves me, there was an old barn or a big old tree to the right, and I couldn't tell where it was coming from. Is it coming from over here, over there? And it got closer and closer. I knew it wasn't a cow or a horse, because being a farm boy, I'd fed cows and horses in the mud, and they make a sloppity, sloppity, slop sound when they walk 4 feet, but this was 2 feet. And I couldn't take it anymore. I said, well, I got to turn the light on, and I did. And I thought I would see that, but I didn't, thank God, because I wouldn't be here today. I would have either died of fright or it would have ripped me to pieces. But as soon as I turned on the light, the footsteps stopped. And I turned on the car, backed up, shone my light across the field, an old barn, and there was nothing there. And all I can think is whatever it was saw the lights turn on, and it ducked down below one of the steep terraces as I backed out. And I'll tell you folks, all the way to the interstate, I was looking in the back seat and behind me, thinking maybe something was chasing me. But that was one of my first reports. I was assigned Area 1 in the beginning, along the Red River corridor, southern Oklahoma, northern Texas. And I thought, you know, there's not going to be any Bigfoot reports up here. I began to memorize some of the counties, like Grayson County is where I grew up. There's Dallas County. And a lot of the reports came from over in this area, especially Delta County, Hopkins County, Hunt County, and we're right here in, what county were we in? Marion, thank you, can't see. Marion, Cass County, Red River County, and I thought, wow, there is a pattern to these sightings I'm getting. And there's so many rivers running from North Texas to South Texas to the Gulf of Mexico, it's staggering. And think of all the creeks that run into these rivers. And think of all the smaller creeks that run into the bigger creeks that run into these rivers. So we began our research around the Sulphur River mainly. If you keep up with Bigfoot research, you probably heard of the Sabine thing. And we had a lot of reports, believe it or not, near Lake Texoma, right north of where I live. Southern Oklahoma, tons and tons of creeks and rivers. My friend Marvin Leeper and John Harrell are here today. Talk to them about the research the research they've done on Clear Boggy Creek and Muddy Boggy Creek. And there's a river called Little River. If you've ever heard of Honubby, Oklahoma, Little River runs from Honubby, Oklahoma to Little River, Arkansas, which is north of Miller County, Arkansas, which is the home of the famous Fount Monster. So there's definitely a pattern that I found over the years. This is Lake Texoma and the Red River, and I was surprised and shocked, but happy, to find all these reports near my house. I don't have time to talk about all of them, but one of them, right here, Brown Springs Road, there's the interstate that goes from Dallas to Oklahoma City. There's a famous casino here. Have any of y'all been to the casino there? One of the biggest casinos in the country. Well, right before you get there, there's Brown Springs Road. You can Google that. A lot of Bigfoot reports there. I'm going to talk about the Callisburg Troll Bridge in a minute, but look at the pattern. Straight across, there's a Hagerman Wildlife Refuge. This is all wildlife refuge, and this is where I get the reports. Up here in the southern part of Oklahoma, there's a hog hunter saw Bigfoot in the Love County Wildlife Management Area, and on and on. Veteran story, there was a veteran came home from the Gulf War, and he was on leave for a little while, and he was going back. Went out to the Red River just to take a look around before he went to Dallas to get on a plane, and he heard some dogs barking. They were coming down the Red River, and they were chasing an ape. They were about to catch the ape, or so he thought. It ducked into some brush, and the dogs followed it in. Well, he heard some yelps and some hollering going on and some bushes being thrashed around, and some of the dogs came out. So I suspect that ape had a compadre in the brush, and he knew where to run and how to take care of these dogs. But that was one of my favorite stories. Now, in the middle of all of this is Monkey Island. A friend of mine by the name of Cliff Griffin said, "Would you like to go to Monkey Island?" I said, "Really? Monkey Island? Why is it called Monkey Island?" He said, "Why do you think?" I said, "Okay, let's go." So we got in our kayaks and went into the middle of the river, and there was this huge island. We spent all day looking around, and unfortunately we didn't find any monkeys, but we found plenty of good habitat for cover, lots of food, and lots of cover. And the water there is only about 4 or 5 foot deep, so a Bigfoot could swim or walk from the mainland over to this island. And like I said, Monkey Island is right about in there. Is it a coincidence? I don't know. I don't think so. The Troll Bridge, the Callisburg Troll Bridge. Story was that the teenagers would go out to this old bridge and park and party. A big hair-covered animal sometimes would come out from under the bridge or the surrounding woods and harass them, and they would take off and go back to town. One of the local teachers at the high school said, "I'm going to put an end to this nonsense. I'm going to prove there is no such thing." So late one evening, he drove out there and parked before sunset and sat there and said, "I'll show those kids this is ridiculous." And guess what happened? From the woods came a huge hair-covered ape man, he said. Strange looking, scary. He was staring straight at him in the car and started walking towards his car. Well, he turned on the engine and left post-haste back to town. The local newspaper, the Gainesville Register, got word of it, and they had an article in there. So I went out there, and some friends and I looked around, and we saw possible tracks, possible localization that day. But what's interesting, when you look on a Google map at a lot of the areas I research, even around here, it looks like this. There's a lot of open pasture land, but the creeks run through the open pasture land, and there's lots of woods around it. Incidentally, I went there a couple of years ago. I was doing another newspaper article. The mayor and a lot of the teenagers who are grown now were there. They said, "Hey, did you hear about the goat man that lived out there?" I said, "Oh, really? Like a Bigfoot with goat horns?" They said, "No, there was an old hermit that lived up in this part of the woods, and he raised goats to help survive. And this animal would come up and harass his goats and occasionally kill some of them. So what the man did was he would kill a goat, tie it to a rope, and hang it near the bridge. Teenagers knew about it, so they'd go look at the goat, and a few days later, the goat would be gone. Did the Bigfoot get it? Did the troll get it? I don't know. Interesting. Delta County Deputy Sheriff got in contact with us. He said, "A friend of mine called me one afternoon and said, 'Billy, get the biggest gun you got, and if your dad's there, have him get the biggest gun he's got and come over as quick as you can.' There was 2 big hairy monsters, got in my pig pen, killed 2 of them, and carried them off." Well, Billy's dad was a Dallas police officer, and he was a Delta County deputy sheriff. They went and looked, and they found huge tracks all around this muddy pen. One set was bigger than the other, but he made a collage of several of the tracks, and this is the last one that survived. So they followed the tracks, hoped they could find the animal, but it disappeared in some tall grass near a dairy. So Billy became a friend of mine. He joined the group. We did some research together, and he called me and said, "Hey, something weird happened. I had a deer feeder out on my property, and it was knocked over, dragged down to the creek. It looks like something beat on it and tore off the door." Said there wasn't any scratches or bites or, looked like a hog or a deer done it. Said something with an opposable thumb ripped the door off and ate all the corn. So we walked out there on a hot July day in Texas, and you know how that is if you live in Texas. And we come across this cattle pond, and across the edge of the pond were these huge tracks. Billy said, that's strange. I don't think those could be people, because nobody ever comes out here, especially on hot July days in Texas. So that's interesting. Let's see where they go. So we followed the tracks up to a hill, and at the top of the hill, it was where his property stopped. The trees stopped. There was a barbed wire fence, and on the other side of the barbed wire fence was an open pasture. We looked up and down the barbed wire fence, and we found this. There was an eastern red cedar that had all of the limbs ripped off from near the top to the bottom and put in a pile at the base. Underneath, it looked like there was a clear bedding area where some animal had been staying. We surmised one of these animals came up the Sulphur River to the creek that attached to this property. Being wintertime, it piled all of the trees on the north side to break the wind so it could stay there and stay warm. It had everything it needed. It had a clear vantage point where it could see anybody or anything coming. It had plenty of food. It found all that corn, and it had plenty of water. So we took this picture. That's Billy's dad when he was retired later, and they went out and took these pictures, but we couldn't find any hair samples that were worthwhile, and it's just another story, but a pretty cool one. Let's move to southern Oklahoma. My friend Marvin Leeper and John Harrell are here today. They found a trackway about 2 or 3 years ago near a creek. And it's one of the best trackways, actually the best trackway I've ever seen from the south. You can see that this is not human. It's flat-footed. The toes go straight across, and they not only found this one track, but an entire trackway. And it was near a creek where they had reports and other encounters. So I didn't get to see it, but Marvin sent me these pictures. Also, Marvin and John have done a lot of years of research in Atoka County and the surrounding counties. There's an old bridge way out in the country, and they've had repeated encounters, if you want to call them, repeated encounters going to this old bridge. 3 weeks ago, just on a whim, they went riding around one night and they said, let's just stop at the old bridge. We've heard them there. We've got thermal images that we've gotten from there. Let's just see. They stopped their truck, and as soon as they got out on the north side of the bridge, there was a big, huge cane break, which is another name for a huge stand of river cane. As soon as they got out, they heard something moving around in the cane. They got out their thermal unit, went down into the creek, looked around, and they got a hit of an animal in the brush. Looked like a big animal. They turned it off, and they got some big eye shine coming out of the cane. As they approached the cane from across the creek on the other side, they heard movement. And that's what these things do in what my investigation in Oklahoma. There's never one usually, there's usually 2 or 3. And as you approach one, another one will distract you just long enough for you to turn around, and that one can escape, and the one you turned around to look at escapes. And that's what happened that night. So, only 3 weeks ago. Very interesting. All of the rivers in Texas run into the Gulf of Mexico, and we followed these rivers down. A friend of mine by the name of Rob Riggs, who is now deceased, wrote an excellent book about In Search of the Bigfoot of the Big Thicket. And I don't think that's the real name, but that's pretty close. We took his book and read it and said, hey, we need to go down there and investigate. So there's 3 or 4 units of the Big Thicket down in southeast Texas. It's, preserved for animals. And we set up game cameras in this swamp. And you can see for yourself, this is a pretty hairy area. And it wasn't good to go in and check these cameras to see if we had pictures. But one of the most remarkable encounters I've ever had in my life with these animals was one night we heard clear Ohio howls. If you're Bigfoot people, you know what an Ohio howl is. Before that, I heard the loudest scream 20 feet away from me in the dark, either human or animal. Loudest scream I've ever heard. Then we heard the Ohio howls. And I don't think the apes that live in the Big Thicket travel to Ohio to learn how to howl. I think they were mimicking the Ohio howls that we were playing. And I think they mimicked. And later that night, one came into camp and just scared the crud out of us. It's in my book, and it's also on a Travel Channel episode called Weird Travels Bigfoot. So if you ever see that, you can look it up on YouTube, but good area. Now I'm getting to what I really want to talk about. My good friend Lauren Coleman wrote this book many years ago. It's one of my favorites. It has a variety of paranormal, stories in it, not just Bigfoot, but like giant catfish in the Cape. You've all heard of big catfish living in the river or the lake. In his book, he talks about similar names, maybe a connotation for a paranormal entity. For example, if it's Booger Canyon, it could be that the Native Americans knew of Bigfoot living in the canyon and the Anglo settlers called it Booger Canyon. Or maybe Devil Canyon. Maybe the Anglo settlers learned from the Native Americans that there were devils living in that canyon. Where we research now in LaFleur County, story has it, that the Native Americans would not take the French explorers into certain parts of the mountains because they said there were mountain devils there. So keeping this in mind, I got to thinking, have I heard of similar names of places? 2 years ago, I was in a canyon in Oklahoma called Boogaboo Canyon. And the Native Americans told the settlers that there are, whatever their name were for Bigfoot, they're in that area and we're not going in there. You can. So I went to Boogaboo Canyon and I was thinking, I thought, well, I've heard some similar names down through the years, and the one that sticks out is Caney Creek. All the way from Kansas to the Gulf of Mexico, I know I've investigated at least a dozen or more reports from Caney Creek. I'd ask the witness, hey, what happened? Well, we heard there was a Bigfoot down the road from our house, so we went down there to, well, what was the name of the place? It's Caney Creek. So I got to thinking, Caney Creek, I think I could put something together with this. And I'll let you read that for yourself, because I hate it when presenters read everything for you. But I think River Cane could be a place where Bigfoot either hide or live, and maybe in the springtime they could eat some of the shoots that grow. I got to looking about cane, and the Florida panther was in danger of becoming extinct. And the wildlife management people had to save the cane thickets in order to save the Florida panther. So they go hand in hand. I think cane is a habitat for Bigfoot. And oh yeah, I said, wait a minute, don't gorillas eat bamboo? Yes, yes. Orangutans eat oil palm shoots, okay? Later on, you're going to watch this movie. I was fortunate enough to be with Seth Breedlove and Law Blackburn while they were filming this. And we were at a lake near Falk, Arkansas, and the film crew actually heard strange vocalizations coming from the north end of the lake. I'd been there before, and I had heard weird vocalizations from the north end of the lake. A year and a half ago, I was with Marvin and some others, and we were there, and we heard weird sounds coming from the north end of the lake. And as we investigated a steep hill on the north end of the lake, guess what we found? Huge cane brake, trails going all through it. And those of you who know about cane brakes, you know animals, all kinds of animals can make the trails through the cane. But we think maybe the Falk monster or his kith and kin made these trails. We looked around and we had to leave the next day because of rain. But I think there's a connection. A lot of you know about Gigantopithecus. It's supposedly a extinct ape that lived in China. And a friend of mine told me, he said, you know, the jaws and the teeth are made for eating bamboo like the giant panda. And possibly, if Gigantopithecus is a Bigfoot, it would eat hard things like cane. We research in the Ouachita Mountains. I'm a member of a group called the North American Wood Ape Conservancy. And we find a lot of places where hickory nuts and acorns have been eaten, and we think these animals have the jaw structure to do that. A friend of mine, Alton Higgins, did an investigation while he was a member of the BFRO. This is on the right is a picture that was taken at a, for lack of a better word, a Native American reservation. They had taken the picture of some friends, and they looked in the background and they seen what they thought was a Bigfoot. There had been a long history at this reservation of Bigfoot sightings. And my friend Alton took the picture from the reservation in central Oklahoma and compared it to the Patterson film, and he's a scientist, he's got a PhD, but he talked about the shoulder structure and the neck structure and the head structure, and you can see they look very similar to Patty. So I think it's a real picture, and also the natives, or the Native Americans said, these animals come into our area through a creek that runs to the Canadian River, because this is mainly Great Plains area, and you think there's no Bigfoot in the Great Plains. Well, if there's rivers there, there could be apes. A little bit about what I'm doing now. What I want to talk about is a friend of mine by the name of Daniel Perez is an investigator in California. Got me interested in an old report. He sent it to Lyle, and Lyle sent it to me. I live near Sherman, Texas. And in the 1960s, there was a report in the newspaper about a gorilla being seen. So I did my investigation, went to the area and talked to the people. They said, on Blue Creek, there could be anything, because it runs into Choctaw Creek. And we've seen lots of mountain lions and strange things, so wouldn't surprise us. The original story was a young man, when he was 8 or 9 years old, looked out his window one night and there was a gorilla. So I found the old man now, who was the young man that originally saw it. And I said, tell me what you saw. He said, oh man, that thing was huge. 7 foot tall, 600 pounds at least. I said, well, did it ever go down on all fours? Oh no, I watched it walk 50 yards down the road on 2 legs. That's the scariest gorilla I ever saw. And I thought, that ain't no gorilla. That ain't no gorilla. So I talked to him, did a little investigation. Daniel followed up. But what's interesting, that night when he saw the gorilla on Blue Creek, further up the road, a man pulled into a convenience store about 3 o'clock in the morning and said, call the police. There is a gorilla in the bar ditch up here. And he saw this gorilla in the bar ditch on Choctaw Creek, about 10 miles due north of where the kids saw the gorilla. So I think this is another instance where a Bigfoot had moved from a big river to a bigger creek to a smaller creek. Here's some statistics real quick, you can read that, but what I really want to impress upon you is think about the miles and miles and miles of rivers and creeks and small creeks. I live south of Lake Texoma, and it's just a staggering amount of shoreline that's at Lake Texoma. So think about how much area these animals have to live in, not just woods, but creeks to move up and down at their convenience to find food or whatever they need. There was a show called The Low Files on about 2 weeks ago, and they talked about the Area X where I investigate. Real quickly, Area X is in the middle of the Ouachita Mountains, very remote area. It takes you about an hour to drive 10 miles into our research area. About 2.5 years ago, Marvin Leeper and I were driving late one night down an abandoned logging road, and as I turned to the right to get on another road, I saw this huge gray animal on all fours walking into the brush. As quick as we could, we drove to the area where the animal went in the brush, and the animal's back hit the top of this brush. And it was as wide as this opening. So you can compare that to Marvin bending over, it was huge. We saw it go in, and we followed it down in the dark, and it went down about 3 feet, and there was this huge clearing where it looked like an animal had matted the foliage down. Marvin had a thermal imager, and he looked around, And he said he saw this. He said it didn't have any ears, it didn't have a tail. Its legs and arms were in proportion to that of a human. And he handed it to me and I looked, and the big old animal was trying to hide behind these little bitty saplings. Little bitty saplings. And it was going like this, but it couldn't hide. Eventually I handed the thermal back to Marvin, and Marvin said, it's running up the hill, go see if you can see it. So I come out of the den, if that's what you want to call it, ran up the road about 20 feet, using my headlamp that was on my cat, looking in the brush, and all of a sudden I saw two huge green eyes, probably as big as a silver dollar or bigger. They were about 6 inches apart, and we were eye to eye. And it lasted about 3 seconds, and boom, it was gone. The next day I went to where I saw the animal, and where it was standing was 3 feet down from where I was, and we were eye to eye. A friend of ours said, oh, it's just a bear. No, I don't think so. And don't tell Chester more, but I think he had a recreation of the ape that he saw as a child. And I stole it from him, and this is what we saw that night. It was a big, huge gray ape we called Old Gray. In conclusion, I'd like to tell you, why am I in this? I'm in it for conservation of habitat. Here in North Texas, they're destroying a lot of bottomland, woodlands, swamplands, and they're using it for water, which we need, but they're destroying this habitat. A friend of mine named Russell Graves made a good documentary. If you can remember that, look up Boat Art Goodbye. Great documentary. His family settled there. They grew up there, but their land is taken away from them now by eminent domain. Some of you locals may know of Marvin Nichols Reservoir. Same thing. People are getting pennies on the dollar for their land. Plus, it's destroying the flora and fauna of these bottomlands. And I would like to preserve that. I would like to see a specimen collected, not just for the Bigfoot. Maybe it needs protection, maybe it don't, but our wetlands definitely need protection, because if it's not stopped, even in South America, the rainforest deforestation isn't stopped, we're not going to have air to breathe, and that's not going to be good. So, in conclusion, this is just a few things I talked about today. I'll be in the back all day. If you have any questions, please come by and ask me. You can read that for yourself. And at the bottom it says, have you had an experience? If you have, come by and tell me. I'd like to know. Maybe it would be in my next book. So that is about it for today. Thank you for your time. I hope you have a great day.